Tonight's lecture builds on Dr. Raymond's major essay, Samuel Griffith and Queensland's War Extermination. Some of you will have already read the essay. If not, I encourage you to read it to make your own assessment about the evidence and the arguments that Dr. Evans carefully develops. Before I introduce our speaker, I should acknowledge the work of many people who made the essay's publication and this event possible. They include the Chancellor, who wrote the foreword, the University's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Raymond Evans, who's unable to join us tonight due to a meeting with the Premier and who sends her apologies. Pro-Vice-Chancellor Scott Harrison, the Law School's Dean, Professor Therese Wilson, Professor Emerita Julianne Schultz deserves particular thanks and particular mention in encouraging the University to publish this important but not final contribution to informed public discussion. We especially thank the University's Law Futures Centre, which edited and presented the work for publication and made it available to be downloaded. Finally, thank you to the Supreme Court's librarian who's standing guard at the door, the Library's Legal Heritage Committee and the Library staff who arranged this event. Tonight, Dr. Evans can only briefly summarise the essay in addressing broader issues about the rigours of truth telling. Often we're told that we live in a post-truth world. Despite this, many of us in science, the humanities, or the law adhere to the idea that while the truth may be contested, it exists. It's worth searching for. In the daily work of courts, judges hear honest individuals competing versions of the truth. What was said at a meeting 5 years ago, who threw the first punch. Often it's hard to believe that these people were in the same place at the same time, but they're honest. In some cases, we're aided by contemporaneous documents, independent witnesses or CCTV images that help us to work out what actually happened. A very wise judge wrote in a civil case about the process of memory being overlaid, often subconsciously, by perceptions or self-interest. He wrote, quote, "All too often what is actually remembered is little more than an impression from which plausible details are then, again often subconsciously, constructed." Despite these challenges in locating the truth, courts try to work out what happened and to choose between different versions of the truth. Part of the exercise is assembling the evidence, including contemporaneous documents. Historians do the same. Lawyers spend thousands of hours reviewing emails these days. Historians spend thousands of hours trawling through the archives. Next, we draw inferences from the evidence, including reasonable inferences about the intentions and purposes of players. What was someone's intent or purpose in doing something or not doing something? Often these are hard and impossible questions to confidently answer. Historians, musicians, literary studies scholars and lawyers also are in the business of interpretation. What's the best interpretation of historical facts? A musical score, a poem, a contract, or a statute? There may be more than one reasonable interpretation. And that's why Dr. Evans' work is called A History of Queensland, not The History of Queensland. I acknowledge other historians who join us tonight, including Professor Mark Finane from Griffith. Last year, Professor Finane and Dr. Jonathan Richards published their response to Professor Henry Reynolds' claims about Griffith and Queensland's violent frontier. I commend to you their Australian Historical Studies article titled S.W. Griffiths, A Suitable Case for Indictment. Actually, there's a question mark at the end of that. I should have used a rising inflection. They really question whether he is a suitable case for indictment. You can download their important article. They observe that, quote, "The list of Griffith's omissions and commissions cannot leave out repeated statements and actions that expressed his view that violence against Aboriginal British subjects was not acceptable and should be dealt with severely," unquote. Fernane and Richards described Griffith as, quote, "a figure of his time and empire, a Dycean figure committed to the rule of law, unshaken in his view of the superiority of British institutions of law and governance." They also write that Griffith, quote, "warned of the dangers of a caste society and undemocratic government arising from the labour competition of unrestricted Chinese or Polynesian immigration." I'd add that the labour movement and most politicians, or like the labour movement and most politicians of his time, Griffith was concerned with exclusion of non-white outsiders. He was not alone in having a view about a white Australia, but as Fernane and Richards point out, that process of exclusion didn't address what place and fate should befall the Indigenous people. The topic of race relations in colonial Queensland brings me to our speaker, Dr. Raymond Evans. In 1975, Dr. Evans co-authored the groundbreaking work, Race Relations in Colonial Queensland, A History of Exclusion, Exploitation and Extermination. He wrote about Indigenous people. Kay Saunders, who joins us tonight, wrote the part of the book about Melanesians, and Catherine Cronin wrote the part about attitudes and responses towards the Chinese in colonial Queensland. In addition to undertaking this groundbreaking and thorough research, Raymond and Kay had the burden of teaching hundreds of undergraduate students each year. Some things never change, I hear the academics in the audience sigh. I was one of the 17-year-olds who they lectured and tutored in 1976. Others are in the audience tonight. Evans and Saunders brought to their lectures and tutorials a depth of knowledge. Their lectures were prepared, organised and delivered with enthusiasm. Almost 50 years later, their lectures and tutorials remain vivid in my memory. Research can have an impact. Good teaching does too. One of my contemporaries in 1976 went on to do the race relations courses taught by Raymond and Kay. She wrote to me the other day that their courses, quote, "opened my eyes," unquote. Opened my eyes. Those three words capture the essence of a university education and the work of good academics, past, present and emerging. I mentioned the enthusiasm that Raymond and Kay brought to their teaching. In 1975, Gough Whitlam implored people to maintain their rage and enthusiasm. Raymond and Kay certainly have maintained their enthusiasm. Recently, Emeritus Professor Saunders co-presented with Dr. Andrew Stumer of King's Council a Selden Society lecture here about kidnapping and slavery in Queensland and the trials in this court arising from slave ships. Their papers and the video are available on the Selden site. I commend them to you. Dr. Evans continues to research and to write his work, Genocide in Northern Australia, 1824 to 1928, as part of the Cambridge World History of Genocide that was published last year. After not seeing him for decades, in 2020 I prevailed upon him to give a very short talk about Griffith's early life. His talk blossomed into an article, Griffith's Welsh Odyssey, which was published in Griffith Review. Tonight's lecture is titled The Rigours of Truth-Telling, but a subtitle might be Raymond Evans' Griffith Odyssey. I invite Dr. Evans to tell us something about his challenging and long solo voyage, his odyssey through the archives.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that generous introduction, and welcome everyone tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Auntie Catherine, for giving such a wonderful opening talk, and welcome to country. And thank you, of course, to the Supreme Court of Queensland and to Griffith University for allowing all this to develop. Okay, so on to the lecture. Social historians, among whom I am happily one, are those utter nuisances of people who adamantly insist on reminding others of all the things they are trying so desperately to forget. Australian historian Manning Clark, channeling Tolstoy, once compared them to deaf people who continually keep answering questions that no one is asking them. Before this new breed of professional troublemaker appeared in the 1960s, Australian history for the majority was a much simpler and more comforting affair. The stray bits of it that I picked up at school in the 50s told of a strictly peaceful, happy land peppered with heroic pioneers, doughty diggers and colourful swaggies, and overflowing with sheep and sparkling golden nuggets. Aboriginal peoples, if they were ever mentioned at all, were way off on the margins somewhere, throwing boomerangs, going walkabout and eating grubs and snakes. In the most studied Australian history book of this era, edited by Gordon Greenwood out of Queensland University, First Nation peoples literally disappear. They're not in the index, and we are even told by one contributor, quote, "The country was empty grazing country awaiting occupation." Now, the principal shock here is not just that this was published without intervention, but that no one who reviewed it or read it pulled anyone up for spreading such academic gaslighting. Perhaps some of you here tonight can recall that balmy time, so reassuring for white Australians. I know it has never entirely left my consciousness. It was the only world about which we were publicly instructed. But it's a far distant place from the one where we are heading this evening. The present modish word for the seemingly recent realisation that the Australian story is not all cosy and blameless is truth-telling. In some quarters, this gets presented as a very sudden epiphany, yet it has a long pedigree. Even while the tortuous frontier process was unfolding in the 19th century, there were always those brave, lone whistleblowers valiantly attempting to get the truth out there and being slammed and shunned for so doing. With Federation in 1901 and its sense of ebullient nationalism, such voices were gradually stilled and abolished. But then, in the 60s, with the global burgeoning of decolonisation and the diminution of scientific racism following the Holocaust, such voices re-emerged. Even here, in distant sunny Australia, a small number of us began clearing our throats. Truth-telling was cautiously back on the agenda. It's hard now to convey to you how much in the dark we then were on the subject of race. In 1965, I produced for my history honours thesis probably the first extended academic account of an Australian mainland frontier. Every day spent poring over official documents, private manuscripts and old newspapers was startlingly revelatory to me. Virtually everything I was discovering seemed to be so new and beyond the historical pale. It left me feeling exposed and nervous rather than confidently assertive. At the same time, race relations historian Henry Reynolds was hearing for the first time about Australian frontier struggle, not from within his own land and culture, but as a young teacher out of Tasmania, listening in astonishment to an African public speaker in Hyde Park, London. So truth-telling stutters and meanders its unstable and episodic course through our past. It encounters the blank stare of denialism, especially on subjects to which a tinge of shame is attached. And Queensland, in particular, with arguably the most forbidding frontier experience and the most concentrated convict punishment profile, is a ripe candidate for such evasion. For so many people, it often hurts to realise. In his recent volume, Truth-Telling, History, Sovereignty and the Uluru Statement, Reynolds states, quote, "Truth-telling is now more important than ever. What has been a personal choice is now a national imperative. Denialism is no longer a viable option. A wall of scholarship built by many hands over the last 50 years stands in the way." So, in building the case for truth-telling, Reynolds expands on this critical importance. It will weave new stories and make older ones richer and more complex, he writes. These will involve the travails of those who became, quote, victims of great wrong. They bring a necessary way to find new perspectives and must be heard and treated with gravity. These are all his words, as they alter traditional accounts. For complexity will have to replace simple sagas of heroic achievement, even if this involves a degree of painful iconoclasm. It will likely produce controversy. As he says, the coals of dormant culture wars are fanned back into life and fundamental reassessments are made. Reputations are called into question and status is reassigned. Now, to that tall order of realigning the consensual interpretive framework, I would add, as a professional historian, that in the process we should not forget the often slippery and elusive nature of historical truth itself. For as every working historian knows, historical accuracy is pursued by a vigorous empirical attention to detail in extant relevant documentation. Fact-finding and truth-seeking need to precede any stern truth-telling. Dependable analysis is also found in historical research by careful, critical awareness of the tensions in both competing and collaborative texts and historiographies. It is this difficult grafting process of measuring competing knowledges that historians are trained to do. All this, we hope, will lead us closer to a clearer sense of accuracy, balance and probability in grasping the past. So as historians, we are thus more in the business of producing knowledge and explanation than in issuing clarion calls for action, dialing out blame or pursuing the singular advocacy of a pressing cause. We do know that the past's other countries once had definite and ascertainable structures that both constrained and enabled human beliefs, actions and agency. So we try to seek these out and explain them in the present, but we cannot re-enter and relive them and thus fully know them. We can't return, we can only look behind from where we came, as the old song goes. This involves caution, as our hindsight vision is necessarily blurred and shifting as we speculate continuously about this elusive past. So, history's truths are unstable ones. They are never fixed, total, and absolute, but remain in a degree of flux as they get worried over by researchers, especially as new data and ways of seeing come to light. Thus, truth-telling should embody the caution that history's truths are specifically contingent and incremental ones. Contingent and incremental, always prone to adjustment. They are explanatory lodestars, leading us along while keeping us out of the swamps of pure fantasy. It seems helpful to conclude that such research and writing requires balance between a certain degree of commitment and a modicum of discretion. In short, elucidation rather than accusation. For even as we try to keep going along the road of attempting truth, any single-minded political crusade or victorious forward march should invite some intellectual circumspection, for the bases of historical truth are invariably constructed on quick or shifting sands. With that in mind, let us focus once more on the 2021 volume of Truth-Telling. My own copy's text is heavily underscored. The margins of this book are peppered with supportive ticks and asterisks, and even the occasional good exclamation mark. Based upon decades of immersion in racial studies myself, I already know that Reynolds and I have much to agree upon. We both independently began unfolding the dispossession resistance model of frontier studies in publications in the early 70s. We have written on similar themes and reviewed each other's published work, mostly positively, since that time. From the late 90s, we occupied the same trench against the quadrant marauders throughout the farcical, media-driven history wars. Both bodies of our numerous writings have dealt with the ongoing partnership between excessive race violence and the tight-lipped denial of it. So, as I perused Truth-Telling, I was on board with almost everything Reynolds had to say, especially between pages 184 and 191, where he favourably addresses the statistical accounting of frontier casualties compiled recently by Robert Auster Jensen and myself. This work nullifies prior estimates suggested by Reynolds by a wide margin. That is, our contention that over 65,000 Aboriginal frontier mortalities occurred in Queensland, opposing Reynolds' earlier estimate of 20,000 dead Australia-wide over a longer time frame. Nevertheless, Reynolds is good enough to write that our calculations, quote, have to be taken very seriously indeed. Once they are widely accepted, as they should be, Australian history will never be the same again. It will no longer be possible to hide the bodies or skirt around the violence. So you can no doubt appreciate how much I am enjoying this book. Even when the focus of blame for horrific slaughter in Queensland begins to descend rather exclusively onto the shoulders of Samuel Griffith, arguably one of Australia's premier legal minds and preeminent statesmen, I remain in interpretive accord, adding my approving marginalia to the text. And so too, in our lecture today, we must now begin to zero in more intimately upon Sir Samuel, as I need to explain to you the process by which my position on his degree of culpability began to change. As Peter just mentioned before, in September 2020, I was asked by him to contribute to a group webinar at the Supreme Court on the great man. The invitation was based not only on my record as a historian, but also because both Griffith and I were born in Merthyr Tydfil, South Wales. So initially my talk was constructed as a bit of a romp, accompanying Griffith back to his hometown in April 1887 with massed choirs, a big brass band and a mock Tudor castle. Matters grew more serious when Ashley Hay, the then editor of Griffith Review, asked me to broaden that talk into a more encompassing essay that eventually appeared in their Acts of Reckoning edition in 2022. In undertaking this, I began to think more comprehensively about Griffith in the 1880s era and the class and ethnic dimensions of both Wales and Queensland as colonial entities. Now, I must tell you that Griffith did not emerge looking too splendidly from that original research foray. His 1880 election campaign had helped excite extreme anti-Chinese agitation, though not as vehemently as his successful opponent, Thomas McIlwraith. Several years later, as Premier, he helped to engineer a crushing defeat of the Great Shearer Strike of 1891, and most pertinently to our topic tonight, also in 1891, he had not acquitted himself well when ambushed by a Melbourne journalist on the matter of racial outrages in North Queensland. Two Presbyterian scholars touring the North had returned with a damning report of race relations there. As stated by one of the investigators, professional Rintoul, it, quote, threw a ghastly light upon deeds of lust, reprisal and doom. Apparently caught unawares, Griffith had ducked and parried in a less than convincing manner by trying to claim that such yarns were more than 20 years old. In a stinging and detailed reply letter, Rintoul rebuked Griffith, who he said was someone he had regarded in high esteem for his vital interest in, quote, the cause of the Kanaka and Aborigines and of all oppressed people. But he could not understand the dismissive sarcasm of Griffith's response. He challenged Griffith to further public debate, but Griffith did not respond. So I thought, here we have Rintoul's contemporary broadside of 1891, alongside Reynolds' 2021 charges that Griffith must be, quote, guilty of what after 1945 came to be known as crimes against humanity. Furthermore, in the same issue of Griffith Review of 2022 that contained my essay, Reynolds had sharpened his attack by declaring rhetorically that Sir Samuel's, quote, neatly manicured lawyer's hands were deeply stained with the blood of murdered men, women and children. This set me wondering. There must be actual evidence in the primary sources that would enhance this damning case, rendering it not only supportable, but probably cementing it. As a troublesome social historian, my bloodhound instincts for deeper empirical research were now aroused. Just how guilty was Griffith among his contemporaries of frontier violence? What body of implicating evidence could be amassed? At this point, I felt particularly scathing towards something Griffith had said to the Melbourne Daily Telegraph reporter in January 1891, when challenged over what he was, quote, doing about the blacks. He had shot back what I should be doing, quickly adding, at all events, few have taken more interest in the welfare of the native population than I have. Influenced by Rintoul and Reynolds, I mentally scoffed at this defensive self-assessment. I was intent at this point on finding all the historical data that would nail him. But as indicated above, historical truth can be shifting and slippery. It does not always take you where you expect it to go. Truth-telling requires careful truth-finding to precede it. And for truth-seeking to work properly, the evidence should lead the way, with the researcher in train, not yet quite knowing the outcome. For one should not start research knowing the destination. One ideally begins in ignorance and curiosity. If the opposite is the case, one is simply satisfying a confirmation bias, the contrived endorsement of a preconception. Now, I began the research odyssey conventionally enough, as any historical investigator should, with a scan of all the secondary Queensland frontier histories for any evidence of Griffith as preeminent culprit. To my surprise, he was absent from virtually all of the indexes. It reminded me of Greenwood's volume and the Invisible Aborigines. Not only did he receive no condemnatory mentions, he largely received no mentions at all. In the published literature, he didn't appear to play much of a role in comparison with other frontier actors. He wasn't there in my own writings on the frontier. In the most comprehensive recent overviews on frontier violence by Timothy Bottoms, Jack Drake and Tony Roberts, who together give the reader the story in startling and comprehensive detail over 1,100 pages of text, they find no need to provide Griffith with a single mention. Since my essay was written, David Marr's massive biographical journey, Killing for Country, and Wal Walker's richly documented study of pastoral occupation called The Squatter's Grab, similarly have nothing to say about Griffith either. And this also applies to Reynolds' own voluminous frontier work. In over a score of texts produced across many decades, Griffith is mentioned just once, uttering a single enigmatic sentence he will repeat in truth-telling, while being confusingly cast in that early volume as, quote, a young Brisbane lawyer in 1880. It's the only time that Griffith receives a speaking part in his recent general indictment. So, curiouser and curiouser, I thought, especially as the texts that do give some significant mention to Griffith and the frontier tend to cast him in a positive rather than a negative light. These volumes are Noel Lew's highly referenced Invasion and Resistance, Gordon Reed's expansive That Unhappy Race, and Robert Auster Jensen's closely argued Frontier History Revisited. Most recently, as we just heard before, in 2023, historians Mark Finane and Jonathan Richards have contributed more case studies demonstrating Griffith's belief that, quote, violence against Aboriginal British subjects was not acceptable and should be dealt with severity. By all these researchers, Griffith is shown as intent on pursuing progressive reform and legal balance in the face of a colonial society mainly calling for, quote, blood and yet more blood, a culture insisting furiously that whites should never be punished for harming or killing non-whites, for this was the nature of the socio-cultural order that anyone considering mitigative reform was up against. So did Griffith pursue frontier reform? Or did he rather plot and perpetuate crimes against humanity? Or even as another speaker, the lawyer Tony McAvoy has recently claimed, war crimes? Or at best, did he do nothing to stop them? The hard data, however, was now starting to pull me in the opposite direction, especially as the bumpy research ride moved up a gear into the documentary records. The logical starting point here was the primary sources of the Colonial Secretary's department, for this mega department was directly responsible for the operations of the Queensland Native Police, the main frontier destroyers. From 1859 until 1897, there were 18 local politicians ostensibly running the Native Police as colonial secretaries across 22 terms of office. A dozen of these men, 2/3 of them, were also leading pastoralists in whose immediate economic interests the native police operated. Serving as colonial secretary for around 2 years and 4 months between November 1883 and April 1886, Griffith was the 6th longest incumbency in that role. Prior to this, the two most enduring colonial secretaries, Robert Herbert and Arthur Palmer, had overseen 15 years' service from the early 1860s to the beginning of the 1880s, when racial violence was at its height in Queensland. They both had large squatting interests and were the force's greatest apologists. Griffith held the office when the frontier was radically contracting into the far northern Cape and the outlying lands of the Gulf of Carpentaria. These remote places were both scenes of acutely continuing frontier violence, and Griffith, while colonial secretary, officially oversaw all of this, at least nominally. I suggest nominally to you here, for as archaeologist and historian Michael Slack points out regarding the Gulf country, it was local pastoralists acting privately, then more formally as justices of the peace, who, quote, influenced and ultimately controlled the agenda of the distant native police, rather than a centralised government in faraway Brisbane. The same might be said more or less of far Cape York. As Queensland reached its fullest dimensions by the 1880s, around 2/3 the size of Europe, this unwieldy size made it increasingly difficult to oversee, service and control administratively. A tendency towards regional excess in the process of land seizure prevailed. Yet if we closed off the analysis at this point, we leave Griffith as colonial secretary politically responsible for frontier warfare during mainly 1884 and 1885. Reynolds writes that while in office he did, quote, little or, quote, nothing to assuage the bloodshed and, quote, took no action to protect Aboriginal rights. This led me to ask, did he really do nothing? Or if rather he did only little, what exactly does little mean? Is this to be seen in hindsight, employing modern expectations and looking back with judgmental frowns, or is little to be weighed in the context of his time and place, in comparison and contrast with his contemporary political office holders? How does one therefore quantify little within its immediate historical circumstances? So I started to examine Griffith's procedures in that office as forensically as the records would allow. The results continued to surprise me, as they may now surprise you. The specifics of that are in that monograph, that recent monograph of mine that some of you have copies of, Samuel Griffith and Queensland's War of Extermination. So I'll just summarise them here. Basically, contingent with Griffith's considerable raft of reforms over the oppressive Melanesian labour trade in the 1880s, he was attempting to forward local remedies in domestic native policy, in inverted commas. This begins soon after he becomes colonial secretary in late 1883, with moves to prosecute individual white employers of Aboriginal labour in the shameful frontier maritime industries. This was followed in July 1884 with the first attempt to introduce protective legislation for Aborigines then exploited as quasi-slaves, the Native Labourers Protection Act. When passed into law, this bill was emasculated by the pastoral and planter lobby in the Legislative Council. Concurrently, The Oaths Act Amendment Act was forwarded, allowing First Nation peoples, for virtually the first time, the right to present their evidence in a court of law. Queensland was the last Australian colony to concede this, and Griffith here completed a process he had set in train while Attorney-General in 1876. This reduced Aboriginal people's vulnerability at law, though it did not, of course, obliterate it. Then, following a much publicised massacre of fringe-dwelling Aborigines at Irvine Bank, a mining centre inland from Herberton in October 1884, Griffith began tentative moves against the existing native police system. Murder trials were instituted against the white commanding officer, Sub-Inspector William Nichols, and the 7 implicated Aboriginal troopers. To Griffith's disappointment and anger, the vagaries of local white justice thwarted this initiative. As a prosecuting attorney, however, he was by now used to this outcome. While Attorney General in the 1870s, he had unsuccessfully tried to pursue 4 other cases of serious criminal intent against native police officers. He was the first such Queensland official to attempt this. Such forays in 1875 to 76 and in 1884 were the only efforts to bring a balanced sense of justice to bear upon the native police. As a result, officers and troopers were dismissed, though not convicted. Following the failed Irvine Bank trials in October and November 1884, Griffith terminated the responsible native police camp at, excuse the name, Nigger Creek, replacing it with a conventional police station. This led on, during 1885, to a new policy developed by Griffith in coordination with his police commissioner, a measured implementation of what was termed complete substitution. It would have been tactically fatal to eliminate the native police in one fell swoop. Several years earlier, while in opposition in 1880, Griffith had played a leading role alongside John Douglas in pushing for a royal commission into the force. This had failed in Parliament on the votes by a considerable margin. In 1885, the outcry and backlash against sudden termination would probably have outshouted the furore the previous year when Griffith tried to have 2 convicted white murderers executed for killing Pacific Islanders, again unsuccessfully. Nevertheless, by mid-1885, Griffith was asserting both privately and publicly that he was, quote, altogether averse to the native police, and was telling Parliament he wanted, quote, to abolish them altogether. As I acknowledge in the essay, it is crucial to recognise that Griffith was not simply uttering vague phrases, regretting frontier behaviour without any accompanying action. Reynolds is simply mistaken on this. Being tactically astute is not the same as doing little or nothing. Given the clearly exterminatory cast of much of Queensland society, it would have been politically futile and probably suicidal to have faced colonial electors with the force's sudden, immediate abolition. So between them, Griffith and Commissioner Seymour advanced a more gradual policy. This envisaged that by replacing native police encampments with conventional police stations and substituting the illegal, quasi-military armed white officer native trooper detachments with regular police sergeants, senior constables and 1 or 2 unarmed Aboriginal trackers, the original force could be progressively phased out. The process began at Irvine Bank, Watsonville and Herberton during 1885. By the end of the 1880s, there had been around a 65% reduction in native police detachments, replaced by some 19 regular bush police stations over much of the north. As historian Noel Lewis observes, Commissioner Seymour, quote, with Griffith's instructions and no alternatives, carried the policy of gradualism forward, despite heavy protests from local whites. In late September 1885, Griffith told Parliament the practice of black police making raids through the country, as in times past, would not be allowed any longer. It would be intended to assimilate the system as nearly as possible to that of the white police. Now, to my reading, this is clear evidence of significant policy change. Though Griffith did not succeed in abolishing the force outright, neither did anyone else. It simply faded away by gradual attrition and the frayed endings of the long frontier process. The last camp at Cowan in North Queensland was not terminated until 1929. Furthermore, from around 1883, ration distribution centres were slowly established, often adjacent to some of the new police stations. The authorities were now observing that many Aboriginal raids were motivated by acute tribal starvation. So ration stations where bullocks were killed for meat and tea, flour, sugar, tobacco were sometimes provided were opened first at Thornborough, Union Camp, Mitchell River, Northcote and Atherton. Simultaneously, the Griffith regime began encouraging missionary enterprise from 1885 across Cape York, first by Lutherans and later by Presbyterians and Anglicans. These missions provided sanctuary against frontier excesses and doubtlessly saved lives. As historian Jasper Ludowick concludes, it was the Griffith ministry, quote, that gazetted Aboriginal reserves and provided support for missionary measures, including access, cash subsidies, rations and limited building supplies. The state's administration of missionary work fell to the Colonial Secretary's Department, which received and processed all correspondence. Within several years, Ludowick finds Christian missions were fast becoming the solution of choice. By federation, close to 30 mission stations had been opened throughout Cape York and the Torres Strait. So in sum, what does this demonstrate? It hardly seems to equate with the actions of a leader singled out from the rest as preeminently guilty of, quote, crimes against humanity. His hands awash with blood. Is any other conclusion possible? Truth-telling rhetorically asks. Well, yes, I think there is. Indeed, we might cautiously conclude that this tranche of changes represents unique and piecemeal, though progressive and expanding policy measures. The primary research task that I undertook discloses, number one, a radical attrition of native police services, number two, implementation of normalised policing, 3, novel introduction of Aboriginal court testimony, 4, an attempted initiative to rein in the frontier blackbirding of Aboriginal workers, 5, prosecution of white frontier crimes inflicted on First Nation peoples, and 6, the burgeoning of missionary enterprise across the north. So deeper primary investigation, to my increasing surprise, had altered my initial conceptualisation. Official efforts from 1883 to 1886 add up to more than rhetorical virtue signalling. They mark a degree of reformation from outright exterminatory policies employing Snyder and Martini Henry rifles. Has a well-oiled blame crusade simply trampled across this in a rush towards a sensational, disparaging verdict? However bad things were in this era, and they were definitely atrocious, liability cannot be laid on any one individual's shoulders, whomever he may be. Griffith's reform attempts confronted an implacable socio-cultural order in northern and western Queensland, and the challenge far outstripped the response. A travelling press reporter there in 1880 found one colonist after another, including, he wrote, highly educated persons, openly professing the doctrine of extermination. He wrote, they look upon any talk of humanity or philanthropy as the mere sentimental language of those who do not know what it is to live there. The remainder of Queensland society was not much different. A former Minister of Justice, John Malbon Thompson, despairingly told Scottish Catholic missionary Duncan McNabb that year that, quote, 19/20ths of the population care nothing about the blacks, and the other 20th regard them as a nuisance to be got rid of. Outspoken frontier journalist Carl Fehlberg concurrently agreed that while a certain minority, quote, acted with barbarity, the vast majority did nothing and a small minority actively protested. That majority of enablers were as guilty as the frontier killers, Fehlberg reasoned, quote, they condone and share the crime. What we observe here, it seems, is a culture of genocidal intent, and anyone hoping to confront it was certainly going to have his hands full. Frontier reform was never mentioned at election time. It was a political minefield, so Queensland electorates had to be slowly cajoled into accepting any redemptive moves. As I write in the essay, reform attempts needed to proceed with extreme caution in an incremental and almost unobserved fashion. Thus, positive initiatives by Griffith during his relatively short tenure in the key office of Colonial Secretary were arguably bold ones in the context of their time and place. What modern hindsight may condemn as doing little or nothing may equally be conceived as doing rather much within what was effectively operating as a genocidal culture, where widespread extrajudicial killing was a permissible norm. So by this point, I had significantly flipped interpretively and was now asking, was it in any way fair or reasonable to single out Griffith as principal miscreant and hold him, perhaps due to his enviable accomplishments and gifted tall poppy status, as a scapegoat made accountable for the crimes and excesses of an entire society and thereby isolated for blame? As Charles Campbell states in his study Scapegoat, A History of Blaming Others, quote, the public is most easily appeased by the creation of a scapegoat. As always, the more serious the crisis, the more important the fall guy. The urge to blame is sometimes incited in us. The notion of collective responsibility is one that we prefer not to engage with. So, collective responsibility is a much harder pill to swallow. Pointing the finger at Griffith, truth-telling declares he did not stop the killing. How then should history remember him? Will his high reputation survive the rigours of truth-telling? Perhaps, more to the point, should it survive? Yet rigorous truth-seeking shows us that among almost a score of colonial secretaries and a dozen or so attorneys general, Griffith appears to be the only one ever attempting anything practically mitigative while holding office. While I had originally scoffed at his defensive claim in 1891 that few had taken more interest in the welfare of the native population than himself, I was now beginning to realise he was probably right. He had done more on the side of reform. It's not, of course, a broad claim to make, given that virtually all his Queensland political and legal contemporaries had either done nothing positive for Aboriginal welfare or made the situation worse. Griffith appears alone among those directly responsible for the native police, as well as all those overviewing the law, in attempting anything, even mildly reformative, in the face of chronic frontier ruination and disorder, as well as the widespread public approval of it. So must he be singled out as some preeminent culprit, allegedly with, quote, blood on his hands for perpetuating, quote, crimes against humanity, by doing so, quote, little? Is it helpful to trash a high-level historical reputation in this way in order to watch how spectacularly and far a tall fall guy might fall? Carl Fieldberg wrote in 1880 that it was Queensland's hands in general that were foully bestrained with blood. And it's clear that there was blood on so many hands in this colony. Over many decades, it had been a virtual free-for-all with no effective legal redress. A register of the known names of frontier perpetrators and those in politics and law who had abetted them, as well as all those in whose direct economic interest the brutality and killing had occurred, would be an extremely long one. There are many such names. Here are some thumbnail sketches of just a few who might precede Griffith in any compilation of indictments. William Forster, Premier of New South Wales in 1859, who bequeathed the native police to the new colony of Queensland. Historian Wal Walker typifies him as, quote, a most vindictive hater of Indigenous Australians. As a squatter in the Burnett district in 1848, he had taken up 64,000 acres of Aboriginal lands. In 1849 and 50, he led reprisal raids against Tarrabilland and Gurang people near Bingara and at Paddy's Island, heading settler armies of up to 100 mounted and armed whites, allegedly killing hundreds of Aboriginal men, women and children. George Bowen, Queensland's first governor, ignoring official instructions that Aborigines were British subjects under protection of the Crown, while redefining his official role as, quote, extending border warfare carried out under some control on the part of the government against hostile savages as his proud contribution towards the general defence of the empire. Robert Herbert, the first and longest continually serving colonial secretary, known as the Native Police's staunchest friend. He wrote of Aborigines officially as, quote, criminals, quote, cannibals, and, quote, very dangerous savages, deficient in intellect. He looked forward to their inevitable extinction. He used native police to secure Gugu Badan territory with violence for his investment syndicate, seizing their lands in the Valley of Lagoons inland from Cardwell. David Seymour, Police Commissioner for 32 years across 16 colonial governments, directly supervising the native police and suppressing evidence of their massacres. As he advanced his substantial financial speculations in gold and tin mining, pastoral land holding and timber getting across the colony. Robert Ramsay Mackenzie, Premier and Colonial Secretary in 1866-7, established a whitewashing inquiry into the native police while Treasurer in 1861, stacking that board with squatters holding over 3.5 million acres of Aboriginal lands. Himself a mega-pastoralist, leasing 52 runs, later made a baronet. Before entering the northern regions in 1840, Mackenzie was involved, along with his brother, in the mass poisoning of Gringai people at Wattenbach Station, northwest of Newcastle. Boyd Moorhead, uncle to the author of Mary Poppins, and Colonial Secretary 1888 to 1890. His family virtually ran the Scottish Australian Investment Company, one of the largest speculators in Queensland pastoral holdings. He stated in Parliament in 1880 that, quote, if there were no Aboriginals, it would be a very good thing. There was not a member in the House, he claimed, who did not think they had to be got out of the way. This wretched, mean race has to go, and go they must. They mainly only got what they richly deserved. Anderson Dawson, Queensland leader of the short-lived first Labor government in the world in 1899, he boasted to the Brisbane Worker newspaper, as part seemingly of his CV as a sterling white man, that in 1886 at the Kimberley Gold Rush, he had played his part in what the paper termed a, quote, nigger massacre. Historical research claims that between 40 and 100 Kitjar people were killed. Dawson subsequently became Minister of Defence in the first federal Labor government in 1904. Now, I could continue with this listing until, as a captive audience, I had you all covering your ears and yelling, "Raymond, enough." But I think it is true to say that most here would not have even heard many of these names before. Yet Griffith, the outstanding historical personage, is known to you, a big scalp, so to speak, and thus readily targeted. Yet, like him, most of these people have streets, suburbs, towns, districts, electorates, rivers, or mountain ranges named after them. Unlike Griffith, though, most of them held wide-scale pastoral interests that the native police were defending over extended time frames against very determined Aboriginal resistance. So it would seem to me that a class communal explanation for the remorseless dispossession might be a better way to determine causation, motivation and responsibility. In short, pursuit of a systems analysis of colonialism as a more constructive way of grasping the fundamentals of this history. This can establish the driving rationale and structural underpinnings of occupation rather than pursuing a singular crusade of individual blame for the manifest theft and violence. This explanation is at first class-based because it is clearly a dominant minority class sector of predominantly pastoralists, but also plantation and mine owners who were the principal land takers, dependent initially on native police sorties and violent raids by their employees to secure the purloined landed wealth. Using the excellent compilation work of the late Queensland historian Bill Thorpe, we find there were over 3,000 pastoral run holders in 1876, contracting to little more than 1,000 by federation. These represented only 1.8% of the income population in the 70s, down to only 0.2% by the 1900s, a tiny sliver of population. But this tiny sector accounted for most of the alienated landholding in Queensland. Furthermore, in the latter stages, it would be mostly foreign-owned by corporations and banks operating outside of the colony and state. These people and organisations, often at centres of political power, were the direct beneficiaries of profit from the captured lands. The various genocidal processes adopted, publicly and privately, to achieve this were in such people's immediate material interests. Communally, most of the white colonial population cooperated in one way or another with the seizure and displacement process, and a minority of frontier actors took a leading part in inflicting and perpetuating it, thinking they were, quote, advancing civilization or, quote, extending the margins of empire. Thus, we might conclude the colonial takeover was class-based in its ultimate economic interest and outcome, and communally driven in its comprehensive destructive thrust. As David Marr puts it in his recent book, Killing for Country, Australia was fought for in an endless war of little cruel battles. Nowhere would that occupation prove bloodier than here in Queensland, and no instrument of state was as culpable as the native police. Slaughter was bricked into the foundations of Queensland. In mid-1880, a reporter for the Sydney Morning Herald, travelling around North Queensland, wrote these prophetic words: "Those who consent to such things and those who approve of them must look well as to how they will stand in future times with posterity when the early history of this country comes to be written. We people here and now are that posterity, and it is imperative that any truth-telling we engage in should be well targeted, balanced and comprehensive. Truth-telling, as Reynolds advises us, is complex, and with that I would agree. Yet my research indicates that Samuel Griffith did not, quote, consent to such things, nor, quote, approve of them, although he is neither the untarnished hero of this story nor its exceptional villain. And he was not, as Reynolds' accounts claim, quote, especially culpable, unquote. Available primary data does not bear this out. That is, as John Lennon once famously sang, I think I disagree. Griffith is part of and party to, among so many others, the British imperial colonial venture that created, for good or ill, present-day Queensland society. As a socio-economic formation and a culture, we have been very slow to accept how utterly that land-taking venture was steeped in bloodshed, and our collective responsibility, historically speaking, for this. Yet is it not ironic that virtually the lone public figure who apparently attempted, however inadequately, to challenge the mayhem should now be freighted with the principal blame for it? Griffith was neither a monster nor a saint. In determining his specific role, it is probably best not to be too certain in mounting clamorous, angry calls for redress, bearing in mind that truth-telling, where history is concerned, can be multi-layered, elusively structured, endlessly surprising, and perhaps at times chimerical. For even after the rigorous application of exhaustive research, history remains mercurial and subject to change, within reach, without falling into one's final definitive grasp. The rigours of truth-telling warn us never to be too sure of the outcome. Thank you.
I'll leave the vote of thanks to the Honourable Andrew Fraser, Chancellor of Griffith University.
Thanks, Justice Applegarth, and thank you to Auntie Kath as well for the welcome. Justice Applegarth did a wonderful job at the start of introducing Dr. Evans, of thanking everyone who's been involved with ensuring that tonight could take place, and indeed for the publication of the monograph. So I won't repeat that, other than to say that, albeit by happenstance, not many times are the MCs thanked in these events. And as I said, by happenstance, Justice Applegarth got to be the MC, which is quite fitting because I could think of no one better, given your own personal odyssey in support of scholarship, of legal history, and indeed of the history of Sir Samuel Griffith. My role tonight, on behalf of Griffith University, is to thank Dr. Evans, the university that's named after Sir Samuel Griffith. There's not much that's named after Sir Samuel, actually, when you think about that life. There's an electorate, a university, there's a Griffith Street in New Farm, it's next to Samuel Lane, and there's Merthyr Road, named after Samuel's birthplace and also Dr. Evans' birthplace. And for the astute, there's Llewellyn Street, which is almost surely named after his son, who died quite young and after whom Sir Samuel grieved so very sadly for the balance of his life. The town of Griffith is not named after Sir Samuel Griffith. I think it's named after a surveyor. And there's not a statue of him anywhere in Australia, at least not that I've been able to find. There's not for someone who was the author of the criminal code that to this day is in force, albeit evolved in this state and in other jurisdictions, both in Australia and around the world. Someone who served as the Attorney General, twice the Premier of Queensland, the founder of the High Court, its first Chief Justice, and the person widely accepted and regarded to be the author or the principal author of the Australian Constitution, there's not a law court named after Samuel Griffith, not even this one, which remains, in my view, a terrible shame. Dr. Evans, my job tonight is to thank you for your address, and to thank you also for this contribution to scholarship in this country, and in particular in relation to the broader issue that represents your life's work. As I pointed out, Sir Samuel is a complex individual. You said tonight that and in this monograph, we should do well not to fall into the hero and villain dichotomy. We should do well not to try and pronounce a conclusion one way or another. Not even a courtroom such as this are we here to declare someone innocent, nor are we here to declare them guilty. What I would say about your contribution in this striking monograph, I'm not sure if it occurred to anyone as an aside else, that when I looked at this, I thought it looked like an image produced by artificial intelligence. And then I thought very quickly, there was nothing artificial about the intelligence of the person represented on the front of this monograph. But Dr. Evans, in your contribution tonight, you not only set out the arguments advanced in your written piece, but you made, I think, a very important contribution at the start to contextualise your own standpoint. I don't think anyone would question your bona fides, but you did a sterling job of establishing them nevertheless. And I think it was particularly notable, and we all would appreciate the intellectual honesty of your divulgence of your own starting point for this work and where you concluded under the weight of that evidence. So I want to thank you not only for the contribution tonight, but if I could suggest more broadly to thank you for your scholarship and for your role in contributing to that slow task of truth-telling. I think you said at the start that it might stutter and meander into the blank stares of those especially in denial. But I think with contributions like tonight, human society is advanced when the sum total of knowledge and insight is advanced. Education is the source code of a civil society, and you've contributed to that knowledge not only in this address, but over a lifetime. So I have, I think the banality says, a small token of appreciation. I can perhaps admit sheepishly that in these straitened times, particularly in the higher education sector, I can assure you that it is on the small and tokenistic side of appreciation. But before I pass it on, I wanted to say thank you not only for your contribution tonight, but I might be so bold as to say thank you for a lifetime of scholarship. Thank you for a lifetime of contributing to the understanding of the Australian people of the much larger story of this nation, not of a federation, but of a land that's much older than a federation. So long may you continue to advance that task of truth-telling. Long may you continue to answer questions that no one answered. Thank you.
That concludes the formalities. Please join us for refreshments outside.